Okay, welcome to part 2 of the timeline controls. And again, if you don't have your timeline, just go up to Window and Timeline. That will bring it right up. Now, the part 1 video, in case you forgot to write this down, let me reiterate, and please write this down. The two most important parts are the frames per second needs to be set before you start animating. And you do that by going to the timeline flyout and going to set timeline frame rate. That will allow you to choose whatever frame rate you'd like. For this assignment, 12 frames per second is perfectly acceptable, and I would recommend it. For this assignment, you cannot use less than 12 frames per second. If you think you want a higher frame rate because you have experience in After Effects or Premiere, anything like that, feel free, all the way up to 24. Please don't use any more than that. For the rest of us, 12 is going to be exactly right. So we're going to set it there. The second thing that's wildly important to remember is that if you ever press the delete timeline, it will just destroy everything without asking you. So don't press that button. It's a dangerous button. For the next bit, I'm going to go ahead and make a duplicate of Snail maybe a couple of times here so that we can have a few to work with. Now, within these tracks, I'm just going to click on the clip here, and the clip is just this bit that you can resize. If I shift click at the top, that will select everything. And if I click on the top and shift click on the bottom, that will also select everything. What if you just want to select a few things? Hold down Control, that's Command if you're on a Macintosh, and click to select whatever you want. Or if something's already selected, click again to deselect it. Okay, so that's how you select things. But what if you have hundreds and hundreds of these things and you only want to look at a couple of them, like say background, maybe Snail Copy 2, and maybe Snail? You can go over to the flyout menu, and under Show, you can set favorite clips. This will automatically change it from, not only will it set your favorite clips, it will automatically change it from Show All Clips, which is what the default is, to Show Favorite Clips Only. So let's press this. Now we have our background, our Snail, and our Snail Copy 2. Notice that Snail Copy is deselected because it's not part of our timeline, but it still exists as a layer. We simply can't see it. So I'm going to go to the flyout menu and Show and set it. Clicking on this a second time, by the way, won't deactivate it. You have to go back up to All Clips. And there we have it. We have all of our snails again. Let me delete these extra snails. Now on that flyout under Show, we also have video groups only. Now we haven't gotten to video groups, so we're going to skip this for now. Just remember, when we get into video groups, you have the ability to only show those video groups. Resume. Okay, so we have the ability to show all clips, video groups. We don't have those yet. We can set favorite clips and view favorite clips. We don't have a comment track, so showing that won't do us any good. But remember how we could add comments? So you could just show those. If we were using global light tracking, we could view those. We're not going to use global light tracking, so don't even worry about that. After Show, we have Enable Timeline Shortcut Keys. Now, on most versions of Photoshop, this is vital to what you're doing. And by clicking Enable Shortcut Keys, Enable Timeline Shortcut Keys, it means you can do things like press spacebar on your keyboard to play instead of pressing play. Now, in my very specific version of Photoshop, they don't work. I hate that, but there's nothing I can do about it except downgrade to another version of Photoshop. So be aware that some versions of Photoshop are just broken, and there's nothing you can do about it. But for those of you who are working on a functional version of Photoshop, I'm going to bring up this blog post on Adobe that says what all of the shortcuts are, and I'm just going to read through this real quick so that you know what you can use once you've enabled the shortcuts. And again, I strongly recommend it. Keep in mind that it will take control of some things like spacebar, so you won't get the hand tool when you're moving around. It also means that if you hit like up and down, you won't be nudging left and right as well. I believe it's like shift left and right. We'll see in a moment. You instead will be moving the timeline around. So let me just read what these do, since I cannot demonstrate it on this specific version of Photoshop. You have tap spacebar to play the timeline at the current time and tap it again to stop. And that will correspond directly to just pressing play and stop. It's really useful. I highly recommend it. You can alt-click on Windows on the time, alt-click in Windows on the current time display in the lower left corner of the timeline panel to switch between time code and frame numbers. I believe that will work regardless. Yeah, so you can always do that one. Don't worry, even if it's broken, you can still get to that. No worries. Alt-click in Windows to on the disclosure triangle next to the layer name on the timeline panel to expand and collapse the list of layer animation options. So notice we've got these. If you alt-click, you'll get all of them at once. That's all that's saying. So you don't have to click on one and then the other. You can twirl them all open by holding down Alt. You'll notice that these don't correspond with the timeline because I didn't get to enable the following shortcuts, use the enable timeline shortcut. So let's skip ahead. Although keep in mind you can shift drag to snap objects. That includes little clips and things to the nearest object in the timeline. We'll use that from time to time. And you can use the Alt key once we get to keyframes so that you can scale them proportionally with it, and we'll deal with that later. Anyway, let's go down to this bit. The up arrow will moves the in point of the current layer. The down arrow moves the out point of the current layer. And just keep in mind, it's just referring to the in and out. So don't worry about that. And then the left arrow or page up will move to the previous frame. Right or page down will move to the next frame. Shift key to do 10 at a time. Now, out of curiosity, can I at least get the page up, page down? No, of course not. It is, in fact, completely bust on my version of Photoshop. That makes me very sad. Left arrow or page up, right arrow, page down, shift to add 10. All right, shift up arrow will move back in time 1 second. That is incorrect. The left arrow, oh no, that is actually correct. Page down, I was thinking of. Shift up arrow will move the time back 1 second. Shift down arrow moves forward 1 second. Shift clicking the next previous frame buttons on the play will jump to the next previous whole second in the timeline. So in other words, you would be able to go 1 second at a time as it goes through. And that's actually true regardless of if you get those enabled or disabled. All right. And tap the home key to jump to the beginning of the timeline, end key on your keyboard to jump to the end. And then they remind you on the laptop, you have to use the FN for the function key to do that on a lot of them. And you can also create custom keyboard shortcuts, which I will frequently do if I'm working for long periods of time so that I can control things better. Under Edit, Keyboard Shortcuts, shortcuts for panel menus, timeline, video, that's a lot, and then you can do it. That's beyond the scope of what we're working on because we're not going to need that many. Again, my particular version of Photoshop will not work with the timeline shortcut keys, which is very upsetting, but them's the breaks. Normally I would do this all the time because I hate having to mouse over to play and stop. But on the plus side, this will allow you guys to see me exactly when I'm playing and stopping. So we'll see the silver lining on that one. Now we have onion skin, but we have to enable the onion skin to work, and we won't be able to do that right now because of how we're working on things. When we are able to, I'll come back to this. Onion skin is just a way of seeing into the past and the future at the same time, or by changing the controls a little bit in one way, a little bit in another. We're not doing 3D in this class, so we're not going to be enabling the 3D tracks. And this is where you enable onion skin. We'll get to that soon, but not just yet. Set timeline frame rate. We've already touched on that. We have panel options, and I'm just going to make these big enough for us to see. It's time code frame number. Again, alt-clicking will let you change that. There we go. Now we can see that a lot better. And then we also have render video. We can also close the tab group and close, which is the same thing as just, going to window and hitting timeline to close it. So I'm just going to leave that alone. And we have render video. Now, render video allows us to actually output a video for the web, and it gives us a certain number of options that we can go through in order to change things like compression, size, and all of that stuff. And we'll be getting to this later, but we'll be using the legacy because the legacy allows us to do GIFs. But I wanted to show you the render video in case you want to render something out for YouTube. You'd use the Adobe Media Encoder, and you'd use the H.264 format. I'd recommend high quality. That will allow you, make sure your frame rate stays the same. That will allow you to render out a video that you can upload to YouTube, which is quite great. You also have the option of Photoshop image sequence. And if you do this, don't use a JPEG, that will degrade things. Use a PNG, a ping sequence instead. And if you're not using an alpha channel, just do straight on matted. Don't do none. Straight on matted will shrink down the file size on that. If you're using an alpha channel, you can set it to be what you need it to be. It's usually black or white on that. Don't worry about that. All frames, for all these options to get everything, you can shrink down your work area by doing a start and end frame. But with the image sequence, what this does, and it will save out every one of your frames as a PNG file, a ping file, that you can then re-import either into Photoshop or After Effects or anything else. But if you do this, I recommend creating a new folder in advance that has your file name of whatever your animation is, along with the frame rate, so that later, if you haven't touched this for years, you won't have to guess the frame rate. You can just read what the folder says, and then you'll be good to go. Now, you'll notice if you do select folder, you have the ability to create new folders inside of Windows, or if you're in a Mac, inside of your Mac OS. Don't do it this way on many, many, many versions of Photoshop. Almost all of them, in fact. If you do that, it will cause crashes and errors, and you'll be troubleshooting for days. So just don't make new folders through the render video. Instead, just go to wherever your folder is going to be, right-click, make a new folder, and then title it like name of whatever, and then the frames per second, and then you'd save out the PNG sequence there, and you'd have it. And you could even maybe add PNG sequence, or SEQ. Whoops, SEQ for sequence. That will allow you to remember what you're doing later. So that's what render does. But again, we're not going to be rendering out a standard video. We're going to be rendering out a GIF, and that involves using the Save for Web Legacy options. Now, the Save for Web Legacy options, we'll cover those when we get to the rendering portion. All right, that's the majority of your timeline controls. You have a couple of more things. You have fades. Now, the fades here, this has to do with video clips, and we're not using video clips, so we're not going to do that. Now, you can actually bring in MP4s and QuickTime files, if those still exist. I believe they do. And you can do crossfades between them, like fade to black, fade in, all that stuff. But we're not going to do that because we're just making little GIFs. You also have the ability to increase the resolution of your images during playback. So in my case, we're going to be working on fairly simple stuff. I want my resolution to be 100 so I can spot errors. You can lower the resolution so while it's playing, it will be at a lower resolution so that it doesn't take up as much space in RAM, so it will be a faster playback. We're not going to worry about that too much. You have the ability to turn on or off audio. Again, we're doing GIFs, no audio, so we'll leave that off. You can go forward to the next frame. You can go back to the previous frame. If you're not at the start, you can go to the first frame. You can play, and that will give you the option to stop. And again, I've already showed you, you can clip these without any problem whatsoever there. You also have the option to render video on the bottom left here. We're not going to be rendering those though, so that's fine. You have a zoom control, which is the standard zoom control. You can add in more video clips by adding media to track, and you do that if you want to add video clips. There's also a flyout here that people tend to miss. This allows you to create video groups, and more importantly, video groups from clips, video groups from clips. You can also delete your track. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. That has less to do with timeline controls and more to do with how you group things together. And we'll cover that naturally as we move through the rest of this assignment. All right, there you have it. After about 30-ish minutes, that's all of your timeline controls. So we're going to get into actually doing some animation. I'll see you next video.